I wanted so much to be like these other leaders. I wanted big houses, lots of cars. I wanted to go on trips. I was clueless to who Jesus really was.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, a podcast with unique stories from the kingdom of God told by the people compelled to live for Him. Last week, we heard from Ryan Dobson, who candidly shared about his life journey dealing with doubts, depression, and disease, and ultimately learning that God will never leave our sides. If you missed it, you can hear that story by visiting our website, compelledpodcast.com. Our guest today, though, is Sheila Booth-Alberstadt, a children's book author who lived the first 40 years of her life virtually ignoring God, but after being confronted by His very real existence, proceeded to treat Him like a genie in a bottle. That is, until He confronted her yet again. That story coming up right after a word from today's sponsor. A great way to celebrate July 4th and the birth of America this year is by signing up your family for a constitutional defense training with Rick Green and his family. This is your chance to experience a one-of-a-kind crash course in firearms training and America's founding documents with America's Constitution coach and my friend, Rick Green. You'll spend your evenings learning from Rick about America's founding fathers and the biblical worldview they held and how that perspective is relevant today. And you'll spend your days out on the range with Rick, his family, and the expert handgun defense instructors of the largest firearms training facility in the world, Front Sight Firearms Training Institute. Hundreds of families have joined Rick and his family on these trips, and they all come home more knowledgeable about liberty and also trained and prepared to defend that liberty and their families. Rick told me that he had his concealed handgun license for 10 years, but never actually carried his firearm, leaving his family at risk because he wasn't sure about his abilities. But that all changed after his first trip to Front Sight 7 years ago. Rick now wants you and your family to experience the same confidence and protection by learning how to defend yourself and your family. Rick and his family take a limited number of families out to Front Sight once a month to train on the range and learn about America's founding. If you'd like more information on how to attend with Rick, visit his website at rickgreen.com. Whether you've been shooting your whole life or never touched a gun before, this is your chance to learn in a safe and professional environment filled with like-minded people that want to be good citizens and also protect their families. Space is limited, so find out more at rickgreen.com and let them know that Compelled sent you. Earlier this year, my wife and I sat down for a conversation with Sheila Booth-Alberstadt. Sheila has a warm and engaging personality, and I asked her to share her earliest memory thinking about God.
I was 6 years old, and I had been taken to a church service, and I had never heard about God up until that point. And I have a little bit, somewhat flashbacks of lights and a tent, so it must have been a type of revival, and An Amazing Grace, that song. That's all I remember. And then I also remember laying in bed praying for Jesus to come into my heart and to forgive my sins. And I prayed that prayer over and over again. I wanted a baby sister really badly. And so I prayed. I'd go outside and look into the stars, and I figured, okay, if there's a God, He must live in the biggest star. So I'd find the biggest star, and I'd close my eyes, and I'd just start praying, God, I want a baby sister for Christmas or my birthday. And that following year, I got a baby sister the day after my birthday. So I assumed, because of that there's a God, and no one could tell me differently.
What were you taught after that point, growing up? Like, what were you taught about God, and what did you believe about Him?
I wasn't taught anything about God. I had a family, originally I'm from Norway, and all of my family in Norway are unbelievers. And I have a few members that are actually God mockers. And basically from the time that I prayed that prayer, I was never fed. I was never nourished anything as far as the Word of God. I didn't go to a church. I didn't know who Jesus was, except for, praying the one prayer. But that same year after my little sister was born, I found out that there wasn't a Santa Claus. And because there wasn't a Santa Claus, I then thought, okay, there's not a God either.
Wow.
And then, of course, I remember being 14 back in Norway. having discussion with family members and relatives about God. And they made such fun of me that I would even consider that there could be a God. And I just remember at that time, I quit talking about it because I was ridiculed.
The ridicule that Sheila received from her family was only the tip of the iceberg. Her home life was troubled and sometimes even dangerous.
My biological father was an alcoholic, and my mother divorced him when I was, I think, about 2. And she remarried another alcoholic, and she herself was an alcoholic. So I was raised with that atmosphere. A lot of mentally abused, verbally abused, emotionally, physically. You never knew what was going to happen. I grew up with so much domestic fighting with my mom and stepdad in the house. I mean, it feels as though maybe 2 or 3 days a week, the ambulances were at the house and police were at the house, and we're talking broken bones and cracked skulls and black eyes. But it wasn't just my mother; it was both of them. They were very toxic. So growing up in that kind of atmosphere is really hard for anyone. And then he died when I was 14, and it seemed as though she took her the drinking and that whole sense of emotions that she had bottled up from her, brokenness. She took that out on me at that point. She's told me this many, many times when she was drinking, that she tried to abort me, and she would jump off rocks in Norway, because that's where we lived at the time. And she would just jump off these high rocks and land just to, so that I wouldn't be born. And I remember when she told me this stuff, that she hated me from the very beginning, and it was always when she was drinking. And I look back now, and I always thought, man, I was really a strong child, but I know God's hand was on me because I always had forgiveness towards her. I knew it was the alcohol and it wasn't her. I knew she truly loved me, and it was just the alcohol speaking.
Like many people who grew up in dysfunctional homes, Sheila's troubled childhood would go on to follow her even after she left her home.
I lived a lie because I didn't want my friends to know my home situation. So I feel like I lied constantly about, oh no, I can't do this, or you can't come over because of this. And, I just felt like I lived a lie. So I was really excited to go off to college and be free of that. But also because I was so needed to fill that, I always call it a hole in my soul. Like I had this hole in my soul, and I needed to fill it with love. And I thought that, a little baby sister, I guess, would have filled it, but it didn't. So then I filled it with food and became bulimic, and was bulimic for 7 years, and went off to college and did tons of drugs. And I was a follower, I was not a leader. And just really horrible things happened to me. I can't even believe that I survived some of the things that took place. So graduating from college was a very difficult task because I just mentally, emotionally really was not strong. But I did, and got married and ended up having a family of my own.
Yeah.
But I was still searching for something inside. I was still just wasn't whole.
Yeah.
I thought, well, maybe it's because of my childhood, and that's when everything kind of went downhill, and we ended up getting divorced. And it was devastating. To this day, it's devastating. I mean, divorce is such a awful, awful thing. And, I know that with God, we all, it's almost such a cliche phrase, but with God, all things are possible. And I look back and think, if I had God, I would never have divorced him. I would have hung in there. But I didn't have God, so divorce was normal in society today.
After her divorce, Sheila remarried, and within 3 years, 4 more children had joined their family. But she still felt the same hole in her soul that she described earlier, and nothing was quite able to fill it. She was a self-described alcoholic, still using drugs, and quickly, the same issues that had plagued her first marriage were appearing again in her second. But right as Sheila was preparing to walk out of her marriage, something unusual happened.
So I was secretly packing up stuff and I was going to get divorced. And I went and saw an attorney and things were in motion until I got a phone call from my little sister that I prayed for. And she basically cried out to me and said, I need to come detox at your home. And I, at the time, I'm thinking, why me? Well, I'm taking care of my older sister's children. Now my younger sister wants to come detox. I have my own problems. Why me?
Yeah.
And she said, because you just got your life together. Well, she knew I prayed for her to come into the world. We've always had this bond about it, because I'm the one who brought you into this world because I prayed for you.
Yeah.
But I think she looked up to me as the big sister who had her life together, and I'm just going to do whatever she tells me to do.
Yeah.
And so she drove to Fairhope, Alabama, where I live. She's down in South Florida. And at that moment is when our lives changed completely. On her drive, I knew she was going to be going through withdrawals. And she
was detoxing from drugs or heroin.
Yeah, she from everything. I mean, I think crystal meth is where that was the drug of her choice at the time.
Yeah.
But also drinking tons of vodka, smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. So she was always high. And for 15 years, when I went off to college and left her back home in Florida, it was really a hard thing for me to do because I was kind of like her mother. I was her caretaker. I protected her from all the violence. I protected her from witnessing my mom and dad fighting and blood and screaming and crying and hair pulling. I would take her and get her out of the house and walk the streets. It didn't matter if it was 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. So when she came to visit, I went to a friend and asked the friend in my neighborhood who was knowledgeable in the medical field. And I said, I've never dealt with anyone who is getting ready to detox. So what do I do with her? And she said, bring her to this revival. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh. But for whatever reason, I said, okay, I will.
And what was the thought going through your head at that very moment?
My immediate thought must have been like, are you kidding me? You want me to take her to a service? This is medical stuff. But immediately I was reminded about praying into the stars for my little sister. And so the next thing I know is I'm thinking, I'll just use it as like a prayer house. I'll go in and pray that God takes away her addiction because it worked with her the first time. So maybe it'll happen again. So that's what went through my head.
Yeah.
And so when she arrived, she was, I don't know about the detox process, if she was using on the way. I have no idea how that worked. But when we ended up going to the revival, I didn't tell her where I was taking her because I didn't want her to say no, because she also had zero God in her life, no upbringing. No one's ever fed us or taught us. And so we ended up going, and when I got there, I told her, she's like, this isn't an intervention, is it? Because I didn't tell her where we were going. I said, no. And I said, but we are at this church service. And I just remember her like, oh, Sheila,
Rolling
I'm not
her
going to be
eyes.
able to do this. And I said, well, let's just go in. And all I want to do is pray. And once you're ready to go, we'll go. And so we went into this building, and there were, I just remember it being loud, a lot of music. There was an evangelist, and he was I don't even think it was preaching. This is where things are a little foggy because everything happens so fast. But we went into the building, we sat down. The next thing I know, I'm looking around at people praying in tongues and singing and hands up. I look over at my little sister on the left, and you can tell she's nervous. Her leg is just going 100 miles a minute, and she looks over at me, and I said, it's okay. We'll go when you're ready. And the evangelist starts walking towards us, and we're sitting on the edge of the aisle, and she's on the seat closest to the end. And he starts walking towards us and he makes eye contact with me. And as soon as he made eye contact with me, I just knew he was going to call me up. And so I put my head down and thought, oh my gosh, don't call me. There's nothing wrong with me. It's her that needs, and I was just praying, oh, don't call me out. And so as he starts walking by, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she needs help. So I pushed my little sister and she fell. And from that moment, that's when things just happened so quickly. I just remember him saying, "What's wrong with you, sister?" And I think he kneeled down with her and then motioned over for people to come and pray for her. And then he continued doing whatever he was doing. But at that moment, immediately I turned my head and I looked up and I just started crying and weeping for probably close to 3 hours. I'm so sorry. I never knew you. And I don't know if I even knew who I was crying to. I have no idea what took place because I can't imagine 3 hours later, I'm still crying that same thing.
As Sheila tells it, this was her first true encounter with God as he convicted her of the sin in her life. She wept because of the guilt that she carried from decades of trying to fill her life with drugs, men, alcohol, food, and anything else that promised to soothe her pain. She wept because she realized that at last, she had found the only cure for the void in her heart.
So the next thing I remember is looking around and seeing lights on in the convention center. People are cleaning up. Everyone's pretty much gone, but my sister is still on the floor in a fetal position, weeping. And someone helped her up. We got in the car on our way home. We didn't say a word to each other. We didn't even know what to say. I mean, we didn't know what happened. But without a shadow of a doubt, we were turned into new creations that night. We were born again. And I walked into that church building one way and walked out a completely another person. And when I got home, I walked into my house and went into the bedroom. I think it was close to 12 o'clock midnight. Walked into my bedroom. My husband was in bed, the husband that I couldn't stand and that I was getting ready to divorce. And I remember looking at him thinking, divorce is not even an option. I will not divorce this man. My little sister came home that night. She never once had a withdrawal. She never sweat. She never threw up. She never craved another cigarette overnight. Now that is a miracle.
When this happened, what did you think was going on?
Maybe that I just encountered God, but because I had no knowledge whatsoever in my head, but I had this knowing of who he was in my heart, I needed to align the two. But I knew that something happened. I knew that I was different. And I had this hunger inside of me that was unquenchable. I mean, to the point of I was at every church I would drive around looking for churches that were open. On Tuesday nights, I'd be at prayer nights at churches. On Wednesday nights, on Sunday mornings, on Sunday nights. Whenever there was a revival, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I was there. And I could not get enough. It had to be in my ears all the time. But I didn't want the word of God to be in my ears. I wanted to hear man teach the word of God. And because I tried to listen to the app with the Holy Bible in my ears, but it just, it just wasn't appealing to me. I wanted that, the preaching to get into my bones where I could feel it. And of course, there are many wonderful pastors and leaders and teachers out there that present truth. But if there's anything that is watered down or a little bit twisted or added to or taken away, it's no longer truth.
In Sheila's zeal to learn more about God, she made an oversight. Unlike the Bereans in Acts 17, Sheila wasn't actually reading the Bible herself. Instead, she clung to every word and teaching that she heard from different speakers and preachers, and she heard many things that sounded very appealing. It was a critical mistake that she would come to regret.
Where I went from that point is into a prosperity gospel, word of faith, very hyper charismatic. And so my understanding was that I am now, because I have the Holy Spirit in me, I now am exactly like Jesus. And I can do everything Jesus did and more. And that I had the power to cast out demons from people. I had the power to be financially blessed. If I were sick, it was because I allowed sickness and disease to enter me, which I could speak to, and it would have to go. And if it didn't go, it was because I had either sin or unforgiveness or fear or simply not enough faith. And so I wanted so much to be like these other leaders who could, it almost became like I was worshiping the person more than God.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be able to have that kind of faith, because if they could get on a platform and lay hands on people and people go falling out or speaking in tongues or being healed, then they've got a lot of faith. And that's what I was searching for. That's what I wanted. I wanted big houses, lots of cars. I wanted to go on trips. I was clueless to whom Jesus really was.
Yeah.
And that I was in that for 5 years.
What's an example of how you would practically live out your life, like on a daily basis with this kind of mindset?
It makes me very sad to say this, but I led my whole family down this movement. And I wouldn't let my kids say any negative word. Every little negative word. I don't feel well. Don't say that, because now you're not going to feel well. You must say that you feel well and you are healed in the name of Jesus. If they were sick in bed, I would go and lay hands on them and pray and just wonder, why can't I heal my own kids? I have to have faith. I don't understand this. Like, why aren't they getting better? I would speak to my own sicknesses and not understand. I have my left eye, it's called a dead eye. Why can't I see out of my left eye? I've been praying for it. Why aren't my varicose veins gone? I've been speaking to them. Why do I still have hypothyroidism and it's not gone? I just didn't understand. And I thought, gosh, I'm never going to get this faith. God, I would pray for it and pray for it and pray for it. I would literally go out into public because I felt like it was also a work basis that I had to go and do these things. And so I would go to Walmart or Target or wherever, and I would look for people that were in wheelchairs or had canes, and I would lay my hands on them and command healing in their body. And I look back at crazy stuff that I did, and it was nonstop. My kids, we would be driving down the road and I'd see somebody on the sidewalk hobbling, and I would pull over and go pray for them. It was normal. That's how I lived my life for nearly 5 years.
And what did you think, like, let's say when you pulled over to pray for someone and, that was in a wheelchair, what did you think would happen, like that very moment?
I believed that they would be healed. And if they weren't healed, then sometimes I would think, well, I know I've got the faith because I'm believing this. So they must not have faith.
What was it about the word of faith movement, the prosperity gospel? What was it about it that was appealing to you?
That people had power to speak things out and it would happen. The people seemed so joyful in church. They seemed successful, and it is so appealing when you walk into a building or a church that everyone is just joyful and crying, and it just seemed like it was such a tight-knit family, and they were going to make sure things didn't happen to you. They were going to protect you and, speak against it and pray against anything that came in your life. It's appealing because you believe that all of these wonderful things are going to happen. You're going to be rich. You're going to be blessed. You're going to have no health issues. You're going to be one big happy family. And yet there were so many things that would be said or things that happened in the church that I had this check. Like, can't be. It just can't be. And I didn't know, who am I to doubt what this person who's been in the ministry for 30 or 50 years, how can I doubt what they're saying? But I was doubting what they were saying.
Like, what's an example?
An example is about never, you should never be sick as a Christian. You should always get what you want for. You can speak to your mailbox and checks will arrive to your mailbox. And I would do those things and they weren't happening. So I'm like, something's wrong, because I know that I love him and I know that I have faith, but I just saw things in people's lives that just didn't make sense. I even ran into some of these ministers that I would meet in person, and it would be like speaking to a stranger. And I'm thinking, whoa, that's so weird, because if you're my brother in Christ, we should be hugging on each other right now. I'm so glad this happened to you. But yet they were so removed, like there was a wall between them. And I just felt like something's wrong here.
I asked Sheila, at that point in time, who did she perceive God to be?
It would be better for me to say who he was is, I guess, what he was not. And he wasn't this vending machine that gave me whatever I asked for in the name of his son. In that whole movement, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I can speak for myself because I was in it and I lived it for 5 years. And God pulled me out of it, not man. But what I realized when God pulled me out of it was that I did not know anything about his sovereignty. I knew nothing about his holiness. I had no fear of God, no reverence for God. I didn't understand his character, his nature, his attributes. All I knew was I've got Jesus living inside of me and I can do all these things. I felt like Simon in Acts 8. I wanted what they have. I was just so misled and had no understanding of who God was. And when I found out who God was, that's when my life changed.
Yeah.
Completely changed.
For 5 years, Sheila had been convinced that God would do her bidding at her command as long as she had enough faith. But slowly, that confidence began wavering. It was at this moment that God chose to work in Sheila's life again.
Well, one day I remember hearing that voice that we all hear. And that voice said, get out of the books, get out of the YouTube videos, get out of those teachings and go read what my son said. And I just knew, I know that is God. I know he's telling me that. And so I called my best friend who, had been a Christian. I'm using quotations, was a Christian for 30 years. She heard the same exact thing, but 24 hours prior. So it was confirmation that this is what we have to do. So we rented we didn't rent, it was given to us, a cabin in the woods in Mississippi with roaches and spiders, completely no distractions whatsoever. We prayed, we fasted. Weeks prior to that, our number one prayer was, God, take out anything that is wrong teaching from us. And we only want what your word says. We only want the truth. And that has been our prayer since that time. That was 3.5 years ago, or 3 years ago that took place. And it's still our prayer today. And so we went into this cabin, and for 4 days we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. She heard, go read the red letters. And so we assumed, okay, what my son said, red letters, it's got to be in the Gospels. And we started reading one chapter out from 6 a.m. until midnight. I'd read a chapter. If we got to a part we didn't understand, we'd close our eyes and just pray, God, help us understand this, and we continue until we finished. And it was 4 days later. And during that time, I know that you can't be born again, but that's what it felt like. We're looking at each other as though, why haven't we ever seen this? Why hasn't anyone ever shared this? This is what Jesus says. Oh my goodness, what is going, we saw a completely different Jesus than what we thought we knew. We saw a Jesus that when you become lovers of Christ, you become less and he becomes greater. We saw humility. We saw, things, all of a sudden, like we were thinking, we're wanting the world. We're wanting big houses and nice cars and success, but none of that matters. We're all gonna, everything's gonna perish one day. What are we doing? We've got it backwards. We are supposed to be getting rid of our stuff and simplifying our life and going after him because of what he did for us. And that was really mind-blowing because it was such a shift in perception of what we thought and then what we think now.
Sheila and her friend were ecstatic. By reading the Bible themselves and reading the words that Jesus had actually spoken, they now had an entirely different perspective on who Jesus actually was. A Jesus that was far bigger than their own personal desires. But Sheila's time in the woods was only the beginning of a longer journey ahead of her. One that started the moment she came home.
We left the cabin thinking we have so much to learn. We have to unlearn so much and relearn so much. But we were excited. We both went to our churches. They went to a church in West Mobile. I was in my church in Daphne, Alabama, and we left the cabin on Sunday morning, met our families at the churches that we loved, and I walked into my church, and as soon as I walked into that door, I just had this wave of grief. All I can call it is this anguish that was inside of me. And I don't even know how to describe what I felt, but I cried the entire way through worship. I cried the entire way through the message. I was on my knees, just crying, sitting in my chair with my head over my knees, just crying. And I know that my family thought, whoa, she just had this spiritual encounter and she's, this is great. And when we left, I didn't even know how to tell my husband, but I just remember thinking, this is not church. This is not what I was just in for 4 days. I just got a glimpse of who Jesus is, and this is not Jesus. And so when I got into the car, I picked up my phone to text my friend, Kim, and I looked at my phone and she said, Sheila, I just left church and it was nothing but a circus. I cried the whole way through. And I thought, okay, that's confirmation. It's not just me. And I don't know. Things at that point changed so dramatically. It used to be what I wanted. But now I look at it as I belong to him, and I sacrificed my life. I remember the day I did it with Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. I remember saying, God, I want to sacrifice my life to you today and give you everything. And you just do whatever you want to do. If you want to take away my family, if you want to take away my career, if you want to take away my house, whatever you've got to do to make me more like Jesus, I'm yours. Mm. And I don't walk a perfect walk with that, obviously, but the beautiful thing is I don't feel entitled to anything anymore. Like, whereas I did, maybe it's what we want. And all of a sudden he's saying, but I've got something so much better.
Yeah.
And when you've had false teaching and your eyes are opened up to the truth, wow, that talk about freedom.
Yeah. Our guest today has been Sheila Booth-Alberstadt. Sheila, it's been a pleasure.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Sheila's journey of faith has had a lot of twists and turns, from not believing that God existed to then believing that God was obligated to meet her desires, and then finally coming to know that God's plans for us are far greater than just our wants on this earth. As Sheila learned, one of the most important tools that God uses to bring people closer to himself is his actual written word, the Bible. Not just hearing preachers teach from it, but actually reading it for ourselves. May we all be like the Bereans and closely compare the teaching we hear with the actual words that God has given us. To learn more about Sheila, visit her website, sbabooks.com. That's SBA as in Sheila Booth-Alberstadt, books.com. I should also mention here that Sheila is the creator of Maggie McNair, a popular illustrated book series for children. Maggie is a 7-year-old girl who is joined by a host of friendly bugs and insects as they learn all kinds of life lessons, ranging from hygiene to knowing who Jesus really is. You can find more about Maggie and her friends at maggiemcnair.com. You can also visit our website, compelledpodcast.com, and look up this episode. We'll include links to both of the websites I've mentioned above, links to some of Sheila's books, and some other helpful resources that Sheila suggested for listeners still wondering about the prosperity gospel. Again, you can find all of that and more at our website, compelledpodcast.com. If you enjoyed today's story and want to keep hearing more, here are a couple of ways you can help out. The first way is to join Compelled as a monthly member. We have different membership levels starting at $10 a month, and as a monthly member of Compelled, you'll receive access to different perks, including the behind-the-scenes recordings from our interviews. So if there was a guest that you really enjoyed listening to, we might have up to 2 hours of interview time with them with all kinds of additional stories and insights that we didn't have time to include in our regular episode. And our $15 a month membership level includes an exclusive monthly live stream. Once a month, you'll be sent a link to an invite-only live stream where you can meet other Compelled listeners, you can meet some of the team members from the podcast, and every once in a while, we might even bring on one of our guests from the show to directly answer any questions you have. And for a limited time, monthly members can receive a free movie from Christian Cinema, another one of our sponsors. Since 1999, Christian Cinema has provided entertainment that inspires families. Christian Cinema has no monthly fees, and they have the largest selection of Christian and family-friendly movies. You can watch a movie today at christiancinema.com and get a free movie by becoming a Compelled monthly member. But of course, the biggest benefit of being a monthly member is you're allowing Compelled to continue sharing these important stories. You can become a monthly member today by visiting compelledpodcast.com and clicking the link at the top that says Become a Member. The second way you can support Compelled is by sharing this episode with your friends. If you know someone who you think would benefit from hearing Sheila's story, then send it to them and consider sharing this episode on social media. Our show was edited by Zach Fowler. Find him online at zachfowlerimagery.com. Our logo was designed by Josiah Jost. You can view his work at sidedesign.com. Our website was created by Ben Billups. You can follow Ben on Instagram at ben.billups. Our media assistant is Frank Allegrea. You can find him on Twitter at @TheFrankAllegrea. Our music outro is by Ben Jackson and Brian Facchino. And our assistant producer is none other than my lovely wife, Sarah Hastings. Our guest next Tuesday is Robert Harris, a missionary to South Asia who has seen God work miracles to bring people into his kingdom. Stay tuned for a sneak peek from that story. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and we'll be back with another compelling story next Tuesday. A great way to celebrate July 4th and the birth of America this year is by signing up your family for a constitutional defense training with Rick Green and his family. This is your chance to experience a one-of-a-kind crash course in firearms training and America's founding documents with America's Constitution coach and my friend, Rick Green. You'll spend your evenings learning from Rick about America's founding fathers and the biblical worldview they held and how that perspective is relevant today. And you'll spend your days out on the range with Rick, his family, and the expert handgun defense instructors of the largest firearms training facility in the world, Front Sight Firearms Training Institute. Hundreds of families have joined Rick and his family on these trips, and they all come home more knowledgeable about liberty and also trained and prepared to defend that liberty and their families. Rick told me that he had his concealed handgun license for 10 years, but never actually carried his firearm, leaving his family at risk because he wasn't sure about his abilities. But that all changed after his first trip to Front Sight 7 years ago. Rick now wants you and your family to experience the same confidence and protection by learning how to defend yourself and your family. Rick and his family take a limited number of families out to Front Sight once a month to train on the range and learn about America's founding. If you'd like more information on how to attend with Rick, visit his website at rickgreen.com. Whether you've been shooting your whole life or never touched a gun before, this is your chance to learn in a safe and professional environment filled with like-minded people that want to be good citizens and also protect their families. Space is limited, so find out more at rickgreen.com and let them know that Compelled sent you.
We were sitting there, one day and we got a knock on the door, and it was some Mormon missionaries. Began talking. They realized, what we were, and so they got out of there pretty quick.
Yeah.
And we just began to think and really just fell under conviction, to be honest, of, man, if these people that have a false gospel can have the boldness to go around in our community and share a false gospel, who are we with a real gospel not to go and share their true gospel? And so we just started following them around, and they would go to a door, and then we'd go after them.